Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So this week, we're going to Modern again. We're kind of in this weird place as far as Standard goes. Not only are the best decks pretty well set at the moment, but we're also waiting for Eldritch Moon spoilers, so for the next couple weeks we'll probably focus a lot on Modern, just because the Eldritch Moon thing doesn't matter as much, and I'm really excited to test out the new Eldritch Moon cards, so it kind of feels weird to brew Standard without having access to some of the sweet new cards. So this week, we're playing Mono Blue Faeries, which is a really cool tempo deck. As you can see, 97 bucks in the paper world, 18 ticks on Magic Online, so pretty cheap for a Modern deck, especially on Moto, where 18 ticks is super cheap. Before we get into the deck, a quick reminder, if you enjoy Budget Magic and you enjoy these videos, it would be a huge favor if you can take a second to click the like button, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff is super helpful, so if you get a chance, that would be great. Anyway, let's talk Mono Blue Faeries in Modern. So, Mono Blue Faeries is this tribal tempo deck. The big advantage of Mono Blue Faeries is they have a lot of cards that work well together. They get powered up by the more fairies you have. They have some cool enter the battlefield abilities. So it's a pretty tricky deck. A lot of the fairies have flash, which makes it hard to play around. You can leave up your counter magic, leave up other instants, and then if you don't need your counters, you can play your fairies at the end of your opponent's turn. You can also play something like Scion of Una, which you can see on screen, in response to a removal spell. Scion of Una is a really powerful lord. So Scion of Una, 3 mana, you get a 1/1 with flash and flying, gives all your other fairies +1/+1, but the big payoff is it gives all your other fairies Shroud. So you can use this to fizzle a removal spell targeting one of your fairies, and you can kind of get this soft lock, I guess. If you get multiple Scions of Una, they're giving each other +1/+1 in Shroud, so all of your fairies have Shroud, including your Scions, which just means Lightning Bolts, Abrupt Decays, any targeted removal does nothing, so your opponent's going to need an actual sweeper, a Wrath of God, an Oblivion Stone, a Ugin the Spirit Dragon, something like that to actually deal with your fairies. The other big benefit of all the fairies is they're evasive, so you got this clock that's really hard for most decks to deal with. If your opponent's playing Jund, they're playing Merfolk, they're playing whatever, a lot of the battles are taking place on the ground, so creatures in the deck are just naturally unblockable, which when you combine that with buffing them up with Scion, plus Scion giving them Shroud, it creates this army that's really hard to deal with. But this isn't like your typical tribal aggro deck. You're not just playing the most efficient things. A lot of the fairies are actually kind of underpowered as far as power and toughness. You don't get the 2/2s for 1 and the 3/3s for 2. Instead, you're playing a bunch of kind of small creatures, and you're getting there based on tempo plays and tricks. So some of our sweet tempo-y fairies are Fairy Miscreant from Magic Origins, a 1/1 for 1 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another Fairy Miscreant, you get to draw a card. So this is a way to keep cycling through our deck. Plus, it's legitimately the best fairy 1-drop, and we really need a 1-drop to power up things like Spellstutter Sprite. So Spellstutter Sprite is super powerful. It's a 2-mana 1/1 with flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to counter a spell with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. So because we're budget and because we're mono blue, we don't have Bitter Blossom, which is a way to get a ton of fairies and make Spellstutter counter anything. So in our deck, this is more counter a Lightning Bolt or Inquisition of Kozilek. If we have a Fairy Miscreant on turn 1, we can counter a Terminate on turn 2. So it counters things relatively inexpensive. In the late game, we sometimes do have a pretty big board full of fairies, and we can counter something that costs 3 or 4 mana. But it's a way, it just temples our opponent out. We are getting a body, an evasive body that's pumped up by our Scions, and getting a little bit of benefit by countering an Inquisition, a Kozilek, or a Lightning Bolt. Pestermite is actually really key. We can play this on our opponent's upkeep, to tap down a land, just to kind of mana tide them for the turn, make them play a little bit less efficiently, maybe mess up whatever their plan was for that turn. Plus, we can play it to tap down a blockers if our opponent happens to have a Restoration Angel or something. And even more importantly, if our opponent plays a Goyf on turn 2, we're trying to race in the air, we can play Pestermites to tap down the Tarmogoyf so it can't attack for a turn. So even though there's no combo like Splinter Twin, we get a lot of value out of the Pestermite by tapping and sometimes untapping things. That's another trick you can do if you have 4 mana. You can Pestermite, use it to untap your land, and then leave up a Spellstutter Sprite or a counter spell. So you can kind of play it for 2 mana if you use its ability to untap a land. Then the big payoff is Mistbind Click. So 4 mana, 4/4 Flying Flash. When it enters the battlefield, you have to champion a fairy. So we have to exile another fairy we control, or else we have to sack Mistbind Click. So there's some risk if we play this with only 1 fairy. If our opponent can kill the other fairy in response, not only do we lose the fairy they killed, we lose the Mistbind Click as well. But when the fairy is championed by Mistbind Click, you get to tap all your opponent's lands. So the main time you want to play this is on your opponent's upkeep. So you have a couple fairies, your opponent goes to untap, play this, it basically time walks your opponent, and you get to attack with all your fairies while your opponent is passing their turn, essentially, because they're tapped out. And it gets really crazy when you can play Mistbind Click multiple times. You can kind of just keep your opponent from casting anything, either because you have multiple copies of Mistbind Click in hand, or we have some tricky bounce fairies. So Quickling, 2/2, flying, flash for 2. When it enters the battlefield, you got to stack it unless you return another creature you control to its owner's hand. And then a single Fairy Imposter, kind of worse. It's a 1-drop. It has the same trigger. You got to sacrifice it unless you return another creature to its owner's hand, but it does not have flash, so that's why it's kind of worse. But the main idea with these cards is we can reuse those enter the battlefield abilities. We can bounce our Spellstutter Sprite back to our hand to counter another spell. We can bounce our Mistbind Click to tap our opponent's stuff again, and when we go really deep, we have, for instance, a Spellstutter Sprite underneath or exiled with our Mistbind Click. When we bounce the Mistbind Click, the Spellstutter Sprite comes back to the battlefield. Champion kind of works like an Oblivion Ring. It's not exiled forever, it's exiled till the creature that's championing it leaves the battlefield. So we play the Quickling, bounce our Mistbind Click, we get back our Spellstutter Sprite, and we can do this all with Flash, because all of our stuff has Flash, counter the spell with Spellstutter Sprite, then the next upkeep, we play our Mistbind Click again, tap our opponent out. So we get this really weird package of tempo and Flash and tricks, and none of these things just beat the opponent on their own, but we get all these weird little tricky advantages that add up over the course of the game and hopefully are enough that in the end we end up winning. We fizzle a lightning bolt here, by bouncing something with Quickling. We counter terminate there with a Spellstutter Sprite. We tap down our opponent's lands for the turn. None of those things are like, oh my god, I just lost the game for our opponent, but those little advantages add up and slowly shift the percentages in our favor until eventually getting in for 2 at a time in the air with Quicklings and 1 at a time with Spellstutter Sprite adds up to us winning the game. The rest of the deck, we have Vapor Snag and Unsummon. So this is pretty much our creature removal. We don't have any really hard removal in our deck. Instead, we have temporary removal. We can bounce something back to our opponent's hand, maybe counter on the way back down. It also works on our own stuff. So if we don't have the Quickling, we can bounce our Mistbind Click back to our hand, get the Spellstutter from under it to counter something, or just play the Mistbind Click again, use it to save our own creatures. So these cards actually do a lot in our deck. Otherwise, we have Mana Leaks and Remands, more tempo plays, takes advantage of the fact that we never really tap out with this deck, since so much of our stuff has Flash. We're playing almost exclusively on our opponent's turn. Leave up the leak, leave up the remand. If we don't have to flash something in, we can, or if we don't have to counter something, we can flash something in. Works really well with the plan. In the mana base, islands, ghost quarters to take care of creature lands and tron lands, and a few fairy conclaves. Just additional fairies, gets pumped up by your fairy abilities, powers up Spellstutter Sprite, can be championed by Mistbind Click. So a good addition to the deck. Because we're budget, we don't have Mutavaults, which would be another really good inclusion in the deck, but we make do. In the sideboard, we have some more counters in Negate and Dispel. We have an Echoing Truth. I really wanted one more bounce spell and decided that we probably should play something that didn't just hit creatures in case of Ensnaring Bridge or something along those lines. So I went with Echoing Truth. Pithing Needle hates on planeswalkers, other things that sit on the battlefield with abilities. Relic of Progenitus helps against Tarmogoyf decks, helps against anything using the graveyard. 2 Dragon's Claws. I think our deck would be a little slow against burn, but Dragon's Claw out of the sideboard might be just enough to flip the clock. And then Spreading Seas. Anyway, that's Mono Blue Faeries. The deck is pretty sweet. It plays some really close, complicated, grindy matches. You're not just going to blow people out with this deck, but if you enjoy decks where you really got to think through the lines of play, where you have a lot of options and a lot of cool things you can do, because not only are all your spells, but almost all of your creatures act like spells as well. So if you enjoy that kind of tricky, complicated, synergistic tribal strategy, I think you'll like Mono Blue Faeries. I think it's pretty sweet. Anyway, that has been our Budget Magic for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.